Hi everyone. In this side you have OpenBB. I'm Didier, I'm the founder and CEO. You have Isan, which is our Chief Product Officer today, who is gonna be presenting how you can utilize AI on the earnings season, and you're gonna learn a lot about how he's been using OpenBB Workspace for conducting advanced research. For those of you who aren't familiar, we've been around for almost 4 years now. We have one of the most popular open source financial projects on GitHub, which is our platform, which works as the data integration product using Python that anyone can use for free. But today we're actually going to talk about the workspace. We have an extremely generous version of the workspace. The workspace is meant to be a desktop application or a web app that you push your data into and you use for doing your own analysis. And this is on the basis on the fact that at OpenBB, we believe that over time, firms are going to want more control over their data, more control over their workflows. They want to structure how they visualize the data, what is the type of analytics and insights that are running on the data, and then all powered by AI. So we fully believe that this is like where the space is going. And so that's where we've been like building the workspace. There's a very generous free tier on the workspace that you can use that has pretty much all of the functionalities except for enterprise features, which I'll show you in a second. But you can connect any type of data that you want. You have full control. It's super dynamic and flexible. You'll see an example today on what Isan was able to do on the workspace. And then you can integrate like any AI agent and do function calling, for instance, from the workspace directly. So you have this kind of intelligence layer that sits right on top of the data. What we do with the enterprises is actually on-prem deployment or VPC. And so the idea is that you'll use an AI product that is in the market and you have to push your prompts or your documents onto a different cloud that you don't own. And so at OpenBB, we believe that you should have control of data to AI end to end. And so you should push the data onto your workspace, which you fully own, and OpenBB or even AI labs do not have visibility onto that data. And then you can integrate like your own open weight models if you wish, or a third-party AI model, but through your walled garden connection, for instance. And so this is something that we've been doing with firms. And then we have a seat-based pricing, a platform fee. And so if this is something of interest after this call, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to talk with you about what we can do. With that said, I think, Isan, you can get started with the presentation, which is the fun part. And yeah, thanks for being here.
All right, sounds good. So nice seeing everybody here. This is Ihsan. I'm head of product and research here at OpenBB. So for this webinar, we have very recently released our OpenBB apps. And this is going to be our first, I guess, a public showcase of what it could do for you. So what I'm going to try to do here is build some AI-powered application that goes through a lot of the common things that a pretend buy-side, sell-side analyst would go through during an earnings season. So the idea is that you will probably be integrating lots of different proprietary data sets to do different parts of the workflow. And here I'm going to customize everything in a way that makes more sense to me. The background example that I'm going to keep using is, imagine that you're one of these analysts who cover a portfolio of stock. Maybe you're a little bit leaning towards on the discretionary side of things for the purposes of this demo. And one of your stocks, in this case, the example is going to be Boeing. They have announced earnings about 2 weeks ago, April 23rd, before market open. And we put together an app that you might want to work with a stock like that before and after the earnings announcement. So it's going to be the agenda. So let's say that you first want to quickly get up to speed on news and main talking points about the stock. So I'm going to basically do some news and web search using the Copilot. You will look into some 8K filings. So think of this as an example, working with PDF documents. Another typical thing that you would do is that you'll probably connect to some sort of data source from analyst expectations and relate the things that the management provided some guidance on to what were the expectations ahead of the announcement or after the announcement. Then we'll look into working with transcript type of data sources, still, unstructured data. But the interesting bit that I'm going to add on top of that is that let's say we move from the written transcript, but look at some sentiment of the audio of that transcript. So we partner with a data source, Market CQ. So they provide some structured data. So you can basically look into the tone, confidence, and the emotion behind that sentiment. So it's a very particular proprietary data source. So this is going to be the example that I'm going to go through, in addition to analyst expectations, like something that's really proprietary that you might have access to. I'll touch briefly on the more structured market data capabilities, price data, market data, intraday data, some advanced charting around that. So we just want to make sure that in this workflow, we shouldn't be thinking about OpenBB or AI in general, just limited to working with unstructured data sources. So you can actually, there's quite a bit you can do with things like market data, time series, and so on. And I guess a little bit bonus for people who will stay all the way. So we're going to do an exclusive first look at the new widget type that we've been working on that we haven't yet released. And I'll go through what we have in mind, and hopefully this is going to open up some horizons, how to work with AI a little bit different than all the examples the traditional examples that I'm going to go through. So let's get started with getting up to speed, right? So in this first example, let's say that I want to quickly get up to speed on what are some of the latest news on Boeing. So we put together a widget here that's like an RSS feed widget. So you can design whatever controls that you would like to do. In this case, my news is coming from Zynga. So I'm going to add this to context, and this is the prompt library feature. So you can pre-engineer your prompts, and so that you don't have to type them on the fly. And oftentimes it takes a few tries to get things right. So I have built a prompt library that is attached to this application. So I'm just going to go through the one that I have tried before, and that works fine for me. So this is, give me one moment. Yeah, so here's the one. So basically, this is the magic button. So I wanted to add it to context and ask about what are some of the key topics ahead of the earnings announcement that people found in the news. And then I don't want just some random news summary. Typically, what you would like to do that the copilots can do a really good job at potentially is that I want to assign every news headline to some sort of topic. So I already might know that there's certain topics that are important for me. So it's always a good idea to give some examples, like, if there's news about China and tariffs, deliveries and production, M&A and deals and things of that nature, but you can come up with other stuff if you would like, right? So here you go, like on April 19, this important news happened about China issue. Here's like a summary of important stuff that happened about deliveries and so on and so forth. So anything that comes out of the chat panel, I can edit to my dashboard directly as a widget, right? So in this case, here's just some text that I can also go and edit. So here I looked at news ahead of the earnings announcement. So I've also prepared the prompt. Let's say that I want to do a web search to look at things, look at the topics and talking points that happened after the earnings announcement, right? So this one, instead of news, I want to ask the web. So here's another kind of functionality that you can add to your AI agent. So I'm using OpenBB Copilot that can use either Perplexity or some other web search tool under the hood and give you citations and so on, and just basically sends this query to the web and summarizes the output, again, assigned to some topic that I want to use the same kind of topics, right? So after the earnings announcement, here are the key talking points on China, on deliveries, and so on and so forth. So now that I have all of these things in my thread, so I'm going to say, let's merge both pre and post April 23rd news into a single memo and summarize it in the following format. Let's say I want topic before text, and I want something like after some text. Yeah. And let's get rid of this one. So I just want to combine everything, and I'm going to add like this one widget as like a markdown that I can in the future share, let's say, with my colleagues afterwards. Okay, so here's like a before-after summary that I generated within just a few minutes, not knowing much about the stock, right? So let's move on to the next subject. So now that we have some ideas around what are the important talking points, let's say I want to look into this 8K to see what came out. Right, so if you're familiar with how earnings workflow generally goes through, this is the first document that people tend to file. So Boeing's filed this before market opens, and then they had the earnings announcement, the discussion with the analyst calls and whatnot later in the day. So here, maybe I want to give a little bit of attention to this grouping piece, like all of these documents that you're going to see that are inserted in the app, so they're not coming from a widget that is available directly on OpenBB. So this is the custom backend that we built for this application, right? So I sourced my files. In this case, I have access to Quarter API. It's a pretty good data source for these type of documents, investor relations documents and what have you. So we use the Quarter API to pull some of these things. And then let's say that I'm the analyst who covers some of Boeing's competitors too. So I basically created all of my widgets so that I can choose which stock that I want to do. And when I do that, some of the other widgets on my application, they will also update. So this workflow, for instance, is a purely personal choice. You can design these things in the custom backend code, whichever that you would like. And that's one of the nicest things about OpenBB, that it's not somebody else that's in control. You're fully in control about like how do you want to build these widgets and so on. So in this case, so you get this long PDF document. The way that we're going to work with this is actually fairly similar. Let me get rid of this. Let's start a new chat. It's generally a good idea when your data source changes to start a new chat. Let's just add this to context. And I prepared the prompt for this one before. So from this 8K, I want to focus on what are some of the things that the management specifically provided the forward-looking statements and guidance. So I will again give some ideas around topics, like I want every guidance to be assigned to a topic. And at the end of the day, what I would like to get is some sort of table. Tell me what exactly is the sentence that you picked out of this PDF, what is the assigned topic, what specific metric that it is talking about, and what is the period that it's referring to. So if you're familiar with how guidance is typically given, it could be about the end of the year, it could be about the next quarter, it could be about 5 years from now on, so it could be about practically anything. So it's always a good idea to provide some sort of context for it. So there you go. Actually, in this case, it created a whole bunch of new categories, such as it talks about backlog, the company's general direction, there's guidance that's given about environment and so on. So again, any kind of output that you get from the side chat panel, you can add it back to your dashboard as a specific widget. So just to go over a very specific example, I'm going to continue with this particular statement that they talked about. That was also in the topics that we've seen before. So there is some issue about Boeing, about their production numbers, right? So they've been providing some guidance that, look, our production numbers are fairly low, but we're going to gradually increase it to producing 737 airplanes. These are narrow body airplanes within the year, right? So they provided that forward-looking statement. So let's say, for example, that you have access to some estimates data and you wanted to see what were the expectations about these things before and after, right? So in this case, this part of the demo, I wanted to focus a little bit on the visualization tools that are available at OpenBB and maybe a little less about the Copilot itself. So in this case, again, I built a very custom look at the estimates data in the context of some of the things that are important for this stock. So in this case, we're looking at analyst expectations around the 737 production. So since the company actually doesn't report the production numbers, like you'd see that the analysts actually don't even agree, even after the report, what is the actual produced amount. But you can kind of see that the expectations from ahead of the announcement versus after the announcement, the expectations of production actually went up. There's some analysts who actually believe in the numbers that the management provide guidance on, but the median estimate, 111. So you need to do a little bit of a mental gymnastics here. The guidance is monthly, so you need to multiply by 3 to map to what analysts tend to speak. So the median estimate is still actually below what the guidance is. So that's kind of interesting. So wanted to also show here that you can always toggle between the underlying data and the visualization. So I had a very specific visualization here, but you can also just switch to something else here. So for example, let's say that I'm interested in a slightly different visualization. Let's make a line chart where I aggregate things by averaging the estimates before and after. So instead of the box plot, the distribution, I just want to see things like that. So the AG grid, the library that we use under the hood, would allow you to essentially create a lot of these things on the fly. And I can add this to context, ask Copilot to summarize it for me, and so on, right? So let's move on for the interest of time. Say, now that we have an understanding of what they provided guidance on, the interesting bit here was that the company at the 8K and whatnot, and you can go through the presentation too, they actually didn't talk through the elephant in the room, which is tariffs in China in these official documents. But this is the transcript of the call that happened during market hours. So I'm going to start a new thread. In this case, let's add this to context. And let's see what topics, in particular, the forward-looking statements that came out in the transcripts, and this would include questions that analysts asked them. And I would expect that China and tariff actually showed up here, even though the company didn't talk about them in the official documents quite a bit. So in this case, I prepared another prompt. So let's say identify and summarize all the forward-looking statements in the transcript. Again, assign them to a topic. Here's a list of topics at the minimum that I care about. You can assign multiple topics if you want. But one thing that I'm asking differently in this context is I want to know who the speaker is, in addition to what is being said, like what is the exact sentence and so on. All right. So it's fairly quick, like we got all of these statements organized by the table that I wanted to see. So again, you can add this table into your dashboard again. So I've run this before because I want to go through, just for interest of time, the specific statement that came out. And like, for instance, like the issues around tariffs and China and tariffs impact. So there was actually, these topics came up quite a bit, and they had to provide some sort of forward-looking statements around they don't reflect this, we have this many deliveries, but they're a little bit bland. So there's another way that I want to give it a simple example. You can analyze the sentiment. So let's say that in addition to transcript, you want to look at what the analyst view is based on some research report and things of that nature. So you can do this on the fly. This was the example that I want to go through. Like you can do essentially drag and drop files. Like they don't have to come from a custom backend. So you can work with even, highly formatted PDF files like these type of analyst reports that say, what is this analyst read of China and tariff issues after the announcement? So I can have a conversation and see what the sentiment is about the analyst report and so on, like how much they read into it and whatnot. So while this is going on, let's move on to markets EQ data. So this is an example for how to incorporate a highly specific and proprietary data set. So in this case, markets EQ is basically analyzing the audio behind this transcript. And based on the audio, notice here that they have the same kind of transcript, but for every sentence that is being uttered, they actually provide some sort of like a score for what is the sentiment in there. So while I was actually talking about this, the Copilot stopped responding. So this is essentially like their take about what the management has said, and they believe that the management underscored some of these things and so on and so forth. Like, despite these challenges, the Boeing management doesn't observe any change in demand and so on and so forth, right? But suppose I want to look at the sentiment even more deeply to see whether an audio analysis picked up a different kind of emotion, right? So I can integrate a data source like this and still do something with it. So I'm going to show you, for instance, like you can work with the data by asking it to Copilot. You can also use the GUI to do things. So I'm looking for the statement that they had around the low 30s that they said. So in this case, for example, the sentiment was actually relatively happy at the neutral side. So they were slightly optimistic, as opposed to in the transcript, it generally comes out as fairly bland. So they actually indicating a lot more confidence, even though we have seen in the analyst estimates that the analyst may not necessarily believe what the management has been conveying. So just for interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next section. So we have worked with unstructured data quite a bit in this demo, but you can also work with time series data, things like market price data and so on. And you can bring those type of things. You can chart them. You can ask Copilot to do things. So in this context, for instance, we brought some data through a custom backend, minutes data from a brokerage. So let's do a little example here, edit the context. Let's ask the question something like, let's filter this data for Boeing, and I want to see the 1 minute bars or 1 minute market data for the first 20 minutes of the market. And I want to chart high and low prices with timestamps against the values, right? So OpenBB Copilot, for example, can generate these type of charts for you directly, as well as like writing notes and descriptions and whatnot. And I also wanted to point out, and sorry if I didn't mention this before, similar to bring any data, you can also bring any agent, right? So I just find it relatively easier to work with the OpenBB Copilot because we have already built in features such as how to do the web search, how to generate the visualization directly, and so on. But you're actually not limited to using our Copilot. So you can add any Copilots following the tutorial here. So for example, I have DeepSeek connected here. I use it for writing. It tends to do, for just personal taste, tends to do a better job writing memos and things of that nature. So you can switch between different types of agents. There's actually no limit to what you can bring here and what you can use them for. But I'm going to continue with this example. So if I want to do something like filter the data, generate the chart based on market data, I can do these type of things. I can bring in data, let's say for daily price data to see how the market responded and such. But I want to show you an advanced charting example. So we plan to do a dedicated webinar on market data, trading order, brokerages, and things of that nature. But we just want to give like a brief sneak peek ahead of time. So we have integrated a trading view chart here in this case. So let's say I want to go back to the day of the earnings on the 23rd. And you can essentially look at the minute bars. This is looking at 5-minute bars for Boeing. And you can basically use all the functionalities that are available here if you want to do technical analysis, draw, make notes, and things of that nature. So the nice thing that we're going to do in a future webinar, don't want to dedicate too much time here, is that you can take this widget, you can essentially put your own particular brokerage or market data source in it and customize it whichever that you would like. So we're going to cover this in a more dedicated webinar in the future. So as a final thing, I wanted to talk a little bit about this new widget that we're working on that we're going to release sometime fairly soon. So here's something brand new, right? So don't take the UI as final. If you guys have any comments after that, we're happy to hear your feedback. But the idea here is this, right? So in all the examples that I've done so far, the way that I've been working with the Copilot has been that, look, I have some data, I add it to the context of my Copilot, then I chat here, and then whatever the output is, I'm adding it back to my dashboard. That's how I've been interacting with it. But as an analyst, oftentimes you find yourself in situations like, why do I need to add this data to context every time? Because you have a very defined sub workflow sometimes, right? Where you want to ask questions to a certain data set, and it doesn't make sense to add it to the context every time that you're working with it. So what do we want to achieve in this case is that suppose that, for instance, I want to work with the analyst ratings and the price targets. In this case, I have access to this data from Benzinga. I put them into some MySQL database, and I just want to interact with this particular data set in a very narrowed, well-defined, sort of like almost a sub workflow inside a bigger workflow, right? So what I can do is that we created this new type of widget, which uses model context protocol under the hood, that my agent can send my prompt, convert it into a SQL query, execute it against the database, and show me the results, right? So this is an advantage that, like, I don't need to add things back into context. I can just basically look at the answer directly. For example, if I'm an analyst, I'm interested in how the ratings have changed. Let's say that I just want to know, just query the database. Like, I don't need fancy controls here. I just wanted to write a SQL query and get me the response. What are the latest unique revisions on Boeing since the earnings announcement date? So now I'm interacting with a dedicated AI agent who knows how to send the SQL query and get me the result back. So I can just make a widget out of this directly. I can see the SQL query that it generated and so on. But let's say that I want to do a little bit more, right? Like, I want you to answer the question, generate this data from the database, and then do something on top of it. So let's say that I want to do something a bit more complicated. So not only I want you to get me the latest unique revisions since the earnings announcement, I want you to go compute the percentage changes after you get that result. And then based on that, I want you to write me a brief note. Who has the highest target right now? who made the latest revisions by percent change, who made the biggest revision since this time, and what is the average price target. So if I want to do something on top of that, then I'm using this widget as a tool effectively, right? So it's like an LLM who is asking an LLM to do something. So this kind of workflow is very exciting that we wanted to share. For instance, now I can add the output data directly to my dashboard. I can do some charting with it if I want to, but the exciting thing is that now I can generate a note based on this data also, right? So the highest price target is $22. Wells Fargo analyst made the biggest revision. They increased their price target by 26%. And based on this data, the average price target actually sits around 192, right? So we believe that this type of widgets that allow you to interact with a database, maybe in the future a code base and things of that nature, is going to open up a lot of interesting workflows. And here's one example working with ratings. So I'm going to stop the demo here. The final thing that I'm going to leave you guys with is the next event that we have on the schedule is that Didier and I are going to be speaking at a conference and forum May 22nd. And this one was more about discretionary equity. So in that conference, we're going to talk more about AI use cases in more quant side of things. So if you're interested in that, you can basically just do a search on this conference and you can catch us up there in person. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing here. And if you have any questions, we can open up the floor.
Thank you everyone for your time. We appreciate you joining the session and we hope we find it valuable. I certainly did. So thank you, Isan. Have a good week. Bye.